Have you ever attempted something which made absolutely no logical sense, took about 1,000,000 hours to finish, and felt ridiculously difficult and pushed you to your limits? Well, that's the story of when I got the idea that I should make my husband a pair of hand-welted Oxford shoes, custom fit to his feet and made using entirely traditional materials and shoemaking techniques. I am obsessed with traditional and historical shoemaking, and I've already made several pairs of shoes for myself, but making a pair of hand-welted men's dress shoes was on my to-do list for quite a long time, and my husband was the perfect candidate to have shoes made for him in this way. I absolutely love the tradition and the care and the detail that is put into well-made, high-quality men's dress shoes even to this day. In fact, traditional high-quality men's dress shoemakers still use many of the same techniques that have been in use for even thousands of years, such as hand-welting itself. What is hand-welting? Hand-welting is the process whereby the shoe upper is stitched to the insole and later the outsole of the shoe. It's known to be a very high quality type of shoe construction that produces a longer lasting and more waterproof shoe, and it's more easy to replace the sole later on when it gets worn out. I have only made one other pair of hand-welted shoes before, and that was actually my first ever pair of shoes. That did not go too well. So you're gonna have to keep watching to see how it went around this, my second time of trying to hand welt some shoes. So in this video, I will be showing you all how I fitted up a pair of shoe lasts to fit my husband's unique feet, how I created the pattern for these shoes, and later how I stitched together the uppers of the shoes on my new post-bed sewing machine. Then I will show you how I painstakingly lasted the shoes, which is where you draw the uppers down over the shoe last and over the insole to create a 3D shape of the shoe. And then I'll talk to you about the hand-welting process and the finishing process for these shoes, which involved creating a pair of stacked leather heels as well. Make sure you stay tuned to the end to see how these shoes turned out and maybe to get a peek of my husband wearing the finished product. So let's jump into it. Okay, let's talk about how I built up a pair of lasts to fit my husband's feet. I first bought these lasts for myself actually from the lovely Vicky Dincheco. They were in a classic menswear sort of shape, but they ended up being too big for me, and so with a little extra building up, I was able to allow them to fit the measurements of my husband's feet. After building them up, I wrapped them in masking tape in order to create the standard pattern for these lasts. Sort of like the equivalent of a bodice block in sewing. So after carefully marking the center line, I then cut off the 2 halves of the masking tape pattern from this last. Placed that down carefully onto paper, which required cutting some relief cuts along the exterior curves, and laying it down onto paper. I then created an average of these 2 halves from which I created the detailed pattern for these Oxford shoes. And then I created each of the individual pattern pieces and cut them out of cardstock with seam and folding allowance added. Okay, it's time to actually start making the uppers for these shoes. So I'm beginning by tracing out my cardstock pattern pieces and carefully cutting them out. And you can see that I marked not only the cutting line, but also the stitching or folding line on all of these pieces. So at this point I chose to reinforce some of the pieces with an extra layer of linen. This is something that is sometimes done on thinner types of leather, and it was something I wanted to experiment with. And now I'm adding my double-sided shoemaking tape to the edge before proceeding to fold under the skived edge of this piece, and in fact all of the pieces had folded under edges. This just gives a more professional, polished appearance to the shoe. Some of the curved edges did require some relief cuts first before they would fold nicely. And I'm just using my awl to do that accurately. So here I've already sewn the back seam of the quarters of the shoes, and you can see I added this fancy little back tab detail. And now I'm just applying the corresponding lining piece to the back quarters. And I'm using glue for this. I alternated between using glue and using the double-sided tape. And now here I am at my post-bed sewing machine, stitching that in place. Going very slowly, of course. Okay, so here is the vamp all finished. And now I'm going to be attaching that to the quarters of the shoe. So for this part again, I'm using the double-sided shoemaking tape to attach it accurately before going in to sew it. This was a very nerve-wracking process because sewing leather is very unforgiving. If you make one wrong stitch, there will be a permanent hole there. And here are the finished shoe uppers ready to be lasted. So let's talk about creating the insole for these hand-welted shoes. This is a very important step in making welted shoes, and it's not as simple as it is in cemented shoe construction because we actually have to carve what's called the welt or the feather onto the insole, which is basically a ridge and a channel that is created for the stitches to be stitched through the insole. So first I'm just going in with my dividers after trimming down that insole and marking the placement of the beginning of the ridge, or the welt, I suppose it's called. So I'm just going in with my knife and making a cut about 1/3 of the way through the insole. And now I'm using my feather knife, which is a knife especially for doing this specific task, and I'm just trimming off that leather to create the beginning of the ridge. This knife is actually more like a chisel. And you can see it's coming along here. So the first step of creating the welt is finished, and now I'm going to go in and create a channel next to that ridge, which is where the stitches will come out again. So I'm actually using my gouging tool to begin that, and then also went in with a knife later. And you can see now it's all neatly finished, and I'm very proud of how this turned out for only my second time. So now I'm just marking the placement of my stitches before going in with my curved awl and poking a hole for where each of those stitches will be. Getting the leather wet first, and then going with my awl. So now, after that's done, it's time to last our shoes. So here's just a picture of what it looks like when they are roughly lasted. Lasting is a process that you want to do in stages to get the leather to stretch and fit and accommodate the last. And so now the lining has been lasted, and I'm going in with the toe puff and just filing that down to make it nice and smooth and even. The toe puff is what's called a stiffener in the shoe, and it will help hold the final shape of the shoe at the toe area. And of course, I'm just rasping that down at the bottom to make sure it's nice and flat. And this is the final lasting of the outer part of the uppers now. So first we use nails to hold it in place. And that's what it looks like when it's done. And then I went ahead and glued that down before proceeding to the next step. Okay, so here are our lasted uppers, and they are ready now to be stitched to the insole. So now I'm going in with these fancy plastic shoe protectors. I bought these a while ago, and they really came in handy for this project because whenever you're making a welted shoe, there's a lot of times when you might damage the shoe uppers if you don't have this shoe protector in place. So I'm actually just tacking that down for now. And now here's my welt strip. So the welt strip is this extra strip of leather with a channel in it that will be stitched to the uppers and the insole, and later also be stitched to the outsole. So it's kind of like the unifying piece that holds everything together. So I have my shoemaking thread wax, and I'm actually using fishing line for the needles, instead of needles I should say, because it's very flexible. It did take me a while to get the hang of how to use this and how to attach it to the thread, but once I figured it out, it was a godsend for this project. So just going in with my awl again, and even though I already poked those holes, I do need to go in each time and just reopen that hole. And I keep my awl in until the very last minute when I'm ready to stick the thread back through the hole. So that way the hole is nice and fresh. And there we go. There's the first thread. And I'm doing basically what is like a saddle stitch, where I have two ends of thread with two fishing line needles on each end, and I'm bringing each thread through each hole. So there's two threads going through each hole. This creates a very, very strong sort of interlocking stitch. Pulling each stitch very tightly so those threads lock together, and these threads are also very waxed, and the wax will help these stitches be permanent. Okay, so I'm 3/4 done this shoe now. This was, again, a very long process, but once I got the hang of it, actually very calming and meditative. The welting process this time, this is only my second time making a pair of welted shoes. It was actually a lot easier than my first time because I had a better idea of what tools to use. And here's the finished stitched on welt. I am very happy with how that turned out, and there's something so satisfying to me about the look of the bottom of the shoe before the sole is attached and you can see all the layers stitched together. Okay, so it's time to add our sole and heel. So the first step before adding the sole is adding what's called a rand. This is my rand strip. I cut a strip of the same welt leather that I used for the welt and added relief cuts, and now it's able to curve around the heel area. Basically what this does is it creates a nice level surface over the heel, which would otherwise be a convex shape. And this just helps level it out because the leather is thicker at the outside than the inside. So not only am I gluing this in place, but I'm also adding wooden pegs to hold it in place. This is what's called a pegging awl, and ideally it's supposed to be able to create the holes that are large enough for the pegs, but at this point I had yet to figure out how to make the awl work for me, so I ended up going in with a small drill bit and making those holes. But make sure you keep watching to the end because later in the process I did figure out how to make the pegging all work for me. So here are all the pegs added, and now I'm just going in with this small Japanese flush cut saw to saw all of those pegs off so they're completely flush with the surface level of the rand, before finally wetting that down so the wooden pegs would swell and hold more tightly. Okay, so now I'm cutting out this sheet of cork in the shape of the hollow area of the shoe. You can see that because there are so many layers on this shoe, the inner area is a little more hollow, and so we want to fill that in with cork, and this also will add extra cushioning for the foot. So just applying my water-based contact cement. This is my favorite glue to use for shoemaking. And hammering that in place before rasping it down to make sure it's completely nice and level with the rest of the shoe. Okay, so here I've cut out my outsole and done a lot of work to it to thin down the outside edges and rough up the inside so it's able to be adhered properly with glue. And it will later be stitched as well since this is a welted shoe. Just using a heat gun to cure that glue before hammering the sole in place. And of course just using my fingers to make sure that the welt is adhered to the edge of the sole. This is the area that will later be stitched together. And just letting that dry overnight with this bicycle inner tube wrapped tightly around it to make sure it's held in place. Okay, so the next morning it's time to start working on this welt, but of course you can see that the sole is larger than the shoe and the welt at this point, so I'm wetting it down before going in with a knife and trimming off the excess so that the sole is completely flush with the edge of the welt. And I'm actually also trimming the welt a little bit at this point because in some areas it was wider than what I wanted it to be. Okay. So we're ready to do our welt stitching. So I'm going in with my dividers to mark the exact placement of each stitching hole so they're exactly evenly spaced before going in with my awl and poking each hole. And you can also see that I cut a flap at the bottom so that these stitches will sit under the flap and not be rubbing against the ground with every step. Okay, so now I'm going ahead and stitching using the same technique that I used for the insole, using 2 threads and the fishing line, and each thread crosses the other thread in each hole. So at this point I thought it was like a good idea to use light colored thread because that's what you most commonly see on welts, but I forgot the fact that since my particular welt for these shoes is black, it would have actually been better to use black thread, but we'll talk about that in a moment. So you can see the technique I'm using. I'm actually looping the top thread through the stitch before pulling it tight, and this just helped give a nice final appearance to those stitches. And you can see on the bottom the stitches are going to sit nicely under that flap. Okay, so all those stitches are done now. So I'm going in with my Hirschkleber paste, which is just a special type of starchy glue, and gluing down that flap at the bottom so that the stitches are completely hidden underneath. And hammering that down. Okay, so at this point I decided I really wanted those stitches on the top of the welt to be black, so I actually went in with a paintbrush and some black dye and carefully painted them black. Now I'm using the traditional shoemaking technique of using a piece of broken glass to scrape off the grain side layer of the bottom of the sole. Also just using a rasp in some areas to make sure the channel area where the stitches are is very flat. And finally going in with sandpaper and sanding the sole all over the edges and the bottom to make it nice and smooth. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and do a second rand for the heel. This is another foundation layer for the heel, and it will help complete the leveling out process that needs to happen at the heel. We want a nice flat foundation before we start applying our heel lifts out of leather. So I'm just trimming that down very carefully to the edge of the sole to make sure they match up perfectly. Okay, so now I've already added one of my heel lifts on top of that, and I'm showing you the process that I figured out by this point for how to apply pegs with my pegging awl. I figured out that the secret is to get the leather very wet first, and then make my hole, and then apply the pegs, and it worked a lot better with the wet leather. Not sure why I didn't think of that before. Okay, here's the first rand now that you see. And I'm just sawing those off so they're flat and level. And here are all of my other leather lifts that need to be glued and pegged in place to create the stacked leather heels for these shoes. And I did already rough up the surface layers of these leather lifts so that they would glue better. And again, I'm using water-based contact cement, hammering each lift in place before also pegging it in place. And now with each lift that I add, I am carefully shaping it, first with a knife and then with a rasp to make sure that it matches the previous leather lifts. It's a lot easier to do it one leather lift at a time than to wait till it's completely finished to do the shaping. This is our final leather lift now. You can see it's a lot larger than the body of the heel at this point, so I have to really go in and trim that down and rasp it down each time. Now that it's all done, I'm going in with sandpaper and sanding the entire surface of the heel. It's very important to get it extremely smooth because that's going to really contribute to the final appearance of the shoe. So now I'm working with a partial rubber heel piece. This is a piece that will be applied just at the outer back area of the heel, which is the part of the heel that typically sees the most amount of wear. This is done in a lot of high quality men's dress shoes. So I'm just carefully cutting out the back portion of the final leather lift and cutting it completely out to make room for the rubber heel piece. And that's what it looks like when it's in place. It will later also be nailed in place. So now I'm just adding my final nails. In hindsight, I would have used nails that are smaller, but I used what I had on hand. And doing, again, a lot of final sanding and polishing up of these shoes before the final dyeing and polishing process will take place. The dye and the polish does not hide any imperfections. If anything, they highlight them, so you really have to get this nice and smooth. I actually wet down the surface of the heel and hammered it down, and this really gave a nice, smooth, polished appearance to the heels. Also going in with my burnishing stick and getting the edges of the sole nice and smooth. And that's what it looks like. Now it's ready to have its black dye and wax applied. Okay, so I wanted to do a decorative pattern on the bottom of the sole, so I'm just marking the placement of that. It's gonna look something like this. So I'm just going in with my black leather dye first and dyeing the edges of the sole, the edges of the heel, and the waist area of the sole. I actually used a Q-tip for these very small, intricate areas to make sure that I didn't make any mistakes. And I did apply a couple coats of the leather dye just to make sure that it was fully dark and black. Now I'm going in with some burnishing wax for leather, and I'm just liberally applying that to all of the black areas before going in with a cloth and just rubbing and polishing that into the leather. And this is what gives it a very nice and shiny finish. And you can see how shiny that can get with just a little bit of polishing. So our shoes are finished now. The very final step is just adding in a sock liner now that the last has been taken out. A sock liner is just a thin piece of lining leather that's glued to the inside bottom of the shoe to hide up any imperfections or nail marks, etc. You can see it looks a little bit messy on the inside, so we're going to be covering that up. This is what it will look like when it's finished. So I'm just cutting that out of the same leather that I used for the lining. And again, using my Hirschkleber paste, it's perfect for this job because it has a longer drying time than the contact cement, so you have more room to wiggle the sock liner around until it's perfectly in place. And that's what it looks like when it's done. So now I'm just going to finish up this lacing. This was my first time experimenting with this horizontal bar style of lacing, but I really wanted to master it because I really like the look that it gives to these shoes. Here is the finished result. So I finished this pair of Oxford shoes. That was a really long process. I would love to hear any of your thoughts, in fact, in the comment section on what you thought about how long that process was. And of course, keeping in mind that what you're seeing now is a very condensed, edited down version of the making process. This is why I say that making shoes in this way doesn't really make much logical sense, especially when buying shoes at pretty inexpensive prices is so accessible to us in the modern day. But that being said, there is such a magic to shoemaking, for me at least. It just has such a pull. Like, shoemaking is just something that I feel in my bones, is something that I'm meant to do. And I'm not saying that it's like my number one passion or anything. I have a lot of different passions, as you'll know if you've watched this video, but there's just something about shoemaking that is so fulfilling, to be able to create this high quality, well put together 3D object that will later be worn on your feet to help carry you through the world and protect your feet from the ground and the elements. It's just really fascinating to me. Something that I will say, since I'm actually recording this conclusion fairly long after I actually finished the shoes, I've had these shoes finished for at least a few months now. I have since completed 1 or 2 sewing projects since finishing the shoes, and there's just something about the shoemaking process, even though it's very different from the process of sewing a garment out of fabric, the skills that I had to learn to make a pair of shoes really actually helped to up-level my sewing practice. And I think it's just because shoemaking is just so incredibly difficult, and there's such a narrow margin of error. Like, if you just do one tiny little thing wrong in shoemaking, it can make or break the project. Whereas I find with garment sewing, even something like corset making, there can be a larger margin of error than with shoemaking. So because I was able to complete these shoes relatively decently, and I had to contend with, you know, all of these difficulties and all of these minute things that had to be done right, it did help to up-level my sewing practice. Because if I'm honest, something that I personally struggle with is attention to small details, and, you know, like just honing in on perfection and measuring things out perfectly and accurately. That's not my strong suit. My strong suit is just the overall creative vision and the overall drive to get something done, not necessarily honing in on all of those details. But if you need to get better at that, like I do, there's nothing better to try than shoemaking, because you really do need to pay attention to all of those small little things. And it's really been cool to see that play out in how it's improved my sewing practice as well. How does my husband like these shoes? Well, he has been dutifully wearing them at least once a week. They're his dress shoes now. He didn't really have a pair of dress shoes before, so it was kind of a win-win. And he has been wearing them at least once a week, and they look really nice. In fact, when I see him wearing them, I look over, I'm like, wow, I made those. Those look pretty good. But they are a little bit on the snug side. He has told me they feel a little bit tight, but the good thing is that the more he wears them, the more they will stretch out, since they're completely made of leather, and leather will stretch with time and with wearing, as I've learned from my Downton Abbey shoes. If you've seen that video, they did turn out quite a bit too narrow for my feet, and they have since stretched out, so they feel quite comfortable now. But obviously, if I make either myself or my husband another pair of shoes, I will be more careful about building up the last adequately to make sure it's wide enough to create a finished shoe that fits our feet comfortably from the beginning. Okay, what would I change next time if I were to make a pair of shoes for my husband specifically, or even just for me, like any pair of shoes? Whew, well, I learned a lot from this project. Namely, the biggest, most stressful issues I had in this project were to do with the type of leather that I chose for the uppers. I don't know what it is about this leather. I'm still learning a lot about leathers and types of leathers and what I like to work with for shoes. So I'm definitely on my learning journey in that regard, but I did find out that I don't like working with this brown leather. I don't know if it has a specific name. I don't remember. I bought it a long time ago, but it has a certain type of coating. It almost looks like it has like a leather paint sort of coating on it that gives it its color and its texture. But the problem is that when you're working with vegetable tanned leather in shoemaking and you're lasting the shoe uppers, you're basically molding this leather over a 3D shape that has a lot of curves in it. And the way that we typically negotiate that in shoemaking, especially with vegetable tanned leather, is that we get the leather wet and we wet mold it over the shoe last to get it to shape, and then it dries and it holds that shape. So that's what I went ahead and did with these shoes, but the problem is that this leather, this particular type, does not respond well to getting wet, and the coating on the leather starts to peel off if it's wet and it's being rubbed too much. So that made it very difficult to shape the leather uppers properly over the shoe last. I also had this issue to a more significant degree in my Downton Abbey shoemaking video. Definitely check that out if you'd like to see that journey of getting those shoes. So this was my second time working with this same leather because I have a bunch of it and I do want to use it up. And I did get better at working with it, but it's still just very challenging. So even the first shoe that I did for my husband had more issues than by the time I got to the second shoe. I knew even more about how to work with this leather in such a way as to avoid peeling and ugly creasing that happened when the leather got wet and dried again. So it's definitely, these shoes are not perfect. If you look closely at them, you'll see all that stuff, but it is what it is. And after getting over my initial disappointment and how the uppers were turning out, I just decided to do my best and learn a lot from this project and at least treat the hand welting process with my utmost amount of care and attention to detail. And it was actually a very meditative process doing the hand welting for these shoes. Even though it took a long time, once I got into the flow of it, it was a very beautiful and calming and meditative process. Okay everyone, I hope you found this video about shoemaking entertaining and helpful, and if there's any one of you out there who is just the least bit inspired to try out shoemaking, I would love to hear from you in the comments section. If there's anyone out there who has questions about shoemaking, send me an email. I would love to help. If you appreciate vintage and historical sewing, shoemaking, as well as natural and historical hair care videos, you will definitely want to subscribe to this channel so you don't miss a future video. I also have a blog where I post the written version of all of my videos along with photos and usually more detail than I can include in the video. So check out the accompanying blog post for this video as well as all my other blog articles, and I also have a free weekly newsletter that you can sign up for on my blog. If you would like to help in a small way to support this channel and to help support me in continuing to create videos as a busy mom, YouTube has now added a thank you button to the bar below the video where you can thank me with a small monetary donation, say enough to buy a coffee, and that would be highly appreciated. If you're interested in the sewing products that I use and recommend, as well as the natural hair care products I use and recommend, I have a couple pages on my blog that you can check out. They will be linked in the description, and I will probably have some recommended products in the description of this video as well, with links to where you can easily and conveniently buy them, so be sure to check that out. Finally, I have an exciting announcement about this channel. If you haven't heard yet, I have recently set up a YouTube channel membership, which is where you can sign up as a member of this channel to receive extra bonus content from me. So there are 2 different tiers of support for you to choose from to suit different budgets. For the lower tier, you will get 24 hours of early ad-free access to all of my future videos, as well as a couple of exclusive posts for members every month. For the higher tier of support, there will actually be a live Q&A live stream with me once a month where you can get on there and ask whatever questions you want answered, whether it be about natural hair care or historical sewing or historical shoemaking, and I will answer you live. And I think that will be a really fun way to connect with you guys in a more casual, sort of one-on-one way. And yeah, I would really appreciate any of you who choose to sign up on there. And in fact, at some point when I get it together, I'm going to start including the names of my supporters at the end of my videos. So that's always fun too. And oh yeah, for the higher tier of support, you will also get a degree of say and sway over my future video picks, what I choose to make videos on. So that could be really exciting as well. Please consider joining, because if enough of you do, it would contribute significantly to supporting me in being able to continue creating content for you all as a busy mom in addition. So yeah, I really appreciate your consideration of this, and I really appreciate you spending your time with me today watching this video and watching this shoemaking process. I'll see you in the next video.